Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the finale of the Jobava London Series. This video is going to be mainly covering all of the Jobava London sidelines, as well as different openings and how you should fight against them if you're a Jobava London player. So let's get started. So first up, let's talk about the Englund Gambit. If you're a D4 player, this is something that you're going to face probably up until 1300 Rapid and maybe like 1500 Blitz. This is a serious sideline that you should consider because if you don't know how to play against it, it's very easy to get lost in these positions and suffer very quick losses. Therefore, when we face the Englund Gambit, we can't really play the Jobava London System with knight c3. However, thankfully, we have a very easy sort of system that we can follow that will enable us to get a huge advantage right off the bat. And these lines are primarily forced, so we don't have to do that much memorization either way. So we start off by taking the pawn quite simply. Now you're going to face either knight c6 or queen e7. It doesn't matter which order you face these moves in, they're going to transpose into each other. So let's say your opponent starts with knight c6. We're going to respond with knight f3, queen e7, bishop f4. Your opponent might give you a check here. This is the whole point of the Englund Gambit. If you don't really know how to play against this, you're most likely going to either lose this bishop, or if you draw back, you're going to lose this pawn. Now, this is completely fine. This is part of our kind of preparation here. I turned on the eval bar so you guys can see what the computer thinks, and the main move here is knight c3. So we're going to play knight c3. So your opponent might play bishop b4, or your opponent might play knight b4. Those are the only two things you have to learn, and most of the time, I'd say 90% of the time, you're going to face bishop b4. So let's start off with bishop b4. The whole point of this is that you're pressuring this knight and this bishop, just applying as much more pressure as you can, developing your piece. We're going to respond with rook b1. Queen a3 is the forced move. There is a queen sack line where your opponent sacrifices their queen for two minor pieces, but obviously this isn't serious. You're just up a piece, you bring the knight back, and you're completely fine. This is obviously quite winning. And so queen a3 is really the only option. From here, you have multiple options, but the move I recommend is knight d5. This is really the only move you have to learn. So knight d5 prepares this knight c7 jump. Here your opponent has multiple options. They're most likely going to go back. So bishop a5, the point is to stop this c7 square from getting forked by the knight. You're simply going to play rook b5 and attack this bishop yet again. The bishops are going to get traded off, otherwise black simply loses this bishop. And if black decides to bring this bishop back, you can take it, sacrifice your rook, then go knight c7 check, win this rook. So the material has been restored to kind of equal, but this position is nowhere close to being equal. His king is not developed, his king is very unsafe. All these pieces are super undeveloped. The queen is on a8 in the place of the rook. You're going to play something like queen b1, and you're going to target this pawn, and you're going to be completely fine. And if something like queen a6, for example, to defend, you can always play even e4 and attack this queen. So this is all you really need to know for this bishop b4 line. Of course, if your opponent doesn't play bishop a5 and does something different, like take this bishop, for example, you can just recapture the queen and you're fine there. Now the king has to move somewhere in order to stop the c7 check. Queen a5 obviously doesn't work because you take the queen, knight takes, and then you win a rook. So after the king moves, he loses the right to castle, and then you play e4, and you have this superior development, awesome center. You're just ready to expand and win the game. That sums up bishop b4. Now let's look at knight b4 and the whole point of playing this move. So knight b4 is kind of like a counterplay attempt to stop rook b1. If rook b1 happens, knight takes c2 and you lose the queen, and obviously lose the game, probably. So given that information, after knight b4, we have to play differently, and we cannot play rook b1, which we normally would against bishop b4. Against knight b4, we're going to play knight d4. This stops this knight c2 capture, and at this point, you're going to be able to win a piece pretty much completely. So you're going to go rook b1 afterwards, no matter what black plays. Black has like 80 different moves. There's no theory in this position because of how bad this is for black. So anything that black plays here, you're going to simply respond with rook b1 because you have tempo on this queen, queen a3, and then you're going to jump this knight into b5, threatening c7 and attacking the queen at the same time. Queen a5, after a3, this knight has to retreat. If this knight doesn't retreat, you're going to capture it, obviously. But if this knight retreats, you simply play knight d5. Now this knight is protected by the rook, and there are two knights attacking the c7 square. There is absolutely nothing your opponent can do to stop you from capturing this pawn. And also, this obviously attacks the queen, so something like king d8, for example, isn't possible because you're going to simply capture the queen. So at that point, you're guaranteed to win at least an exchange and probably more than that. So you're completely fine. And that really covers the Englund Gambit altogether. Okay, so if you don't face the Englund Gambit, you might also encounter something known as the Dutch defense, which is a really popular kind of sideline-ish defense against d4. It's not exactly the best way to play, but anywhere under Grandmaster level, you can get away with it. So against this, we're gonna play knight c3. There are a ton of ways you can play against the Dutch defense. You can play g3, you can play c4 and play in the Catalan style, which would be known as the fianchetto variation, which is very good. Obviously, if you're a Catalan player, then you should go with whatever you're more familiar with. But given that we're playing the Jobava London system, we can use our Jobava London approach to this opening. So after knight c3, knight f6, and bishop f4. This is a position we're all familiar with, and we're getting a very similar position that we've discussed in one of our first videos about g6 setups and like kind of King's Indian setups. The big difference here is that there's a pawn on f4, and so our kind of game plan switches. We're not really able to push the g4 pawn because then it's going to get captured. And so in that sense, we're kind of limited in our playstyle, but that doesn't restrict us. We can still play h4 and continue marching forward. We can play e3. This is just normal development. After bishop g7, this is already slightly better for white. This is just very passive for black, and the knight on c3 is quite powerful actually. Knight b5 jump is possible in some positions, especially if your opponent malfunctions and plays something like knight c6. After castling, you can simply continue pushing h5, and this is the interesting part, where we're able to kind of get an advantage through a exchange sacrifice. So once the knight captures, you're going to recapture the rook, pawn takes, and now you have a small advantage in the sense that your pieces are much better placed. You're ready to continue marching on forward. Your knight's going to get developed very quickly. You have all these checkmate threats, and so you're definitely much better here. If your opponent tries to trade, and this is the very cool thing about this position, if your opponent tries to trade with you using queen e8, you can actually trade this queen off because you have a forced knight c7 fork. So this is the one position. If you get this exact position, you're going to be able to pull this off. There's actually nothing your opponent can do to stop this. So you can play knight a6, you take the knight with your bishop, and then you go knight c7, and you get your exchange back. Now you're just up a clean pawn. These pawns are doubled, and so obviously you're much better in that position. Now there are other things your opponent can do. They don't have to play queen e8. They can play something like e6 or even, let's say, d6, for example. Trying to protect this pawn more and develop their pieces. After d6, you can play bishop c4, give this check. Now you can just follow up with knight e2 or knight f3. Either move works fine. Knight e2 is kind of more safe, more solid. Knight f3 is an attempt to play knight g5, although that can be met with something like bishop f6 beforehand. It's kind of hard to judge what plan you should go for, but both plans are absolutely fine, and that's why I wanted to highlight knight e2, just to demonstrate that it is a very much viable option. If your opponent plays queen a here now, you're not really able to go for the same thing. You should retreat back to queen h4, and you will be fine. If you decide to take this queen, you will be losing, because now you're just down in exchange with almost no initiative. Knight g5 here doesn't work, because even though you're threatening the same idea, knight a6 here kind of stops it, since your knight blocks in the bishop, and the bishop obviously isn't able to capture through its own knight. So with that being said, you shouldn't really trade queens unless you had that very specific line where you could just jump your knight into d5 and there was no possible way of stopping this c7 fork. But right here, you should go to queen h4, and then you can play something like even queen g3, or you can long castle and just bring your rook over to h1, and you're going to be completely fine from there. You're going to be threatening a lot of things. You're doing extremely well. Black's king is very much unsafe. The pawn structure is very awkward, and the pieces are so underdeveloped that you definitely control all of the initiative, and you should be able to win this game. Now, of course, your opponent might stop your plan as early as, move 5 and just play h5. In that case, you're going to be better because of the awful pawn placement on the king side. You're going to be able to exploit that using your knight. There's a very nice outpost here on g5 for your knight. And of course, if your opponent chooses to castle kingside, they're going to be in a great deal of danger because of these overextended pawns. So it's going to take a very long time for your opponent to actually get his king to safety, because he has to develop all of these pieces before they can castle queenside. And so therefore, you're going to have to use that to your advantage. This is like +1 type of position, so you should be good from here. Now, before we start the next variation, I just wanted to remind you guys to please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps me a ton, and it will help you stay notified for when future videos come out. Thank you. Now let's take a look at some Benoni systems, so things like c5 or knight f6 and then c5. Let's start with c5. This is the Benoni sort of system. You're going to play d5. You can't really play knight c3 here, otherwise you're just going to end up worse, because knight c6, and you have to move your queen. You lost the tempo, so black pretty much equalizes right off the bat. And you're also not able to do, the things you normally would with bishop f4 and knight b5, just because you lose that tempo. You have to move your queen, and black is just in time to stop your plans. So instead of knight c3, we're going to push this pawn. Usually you're going to get something like knight f6. These positions usually transpose into each other, so the move order doesn't matter that much. All you have to know is that you have to push this pawn upon meeting c5. And after something like d6, you're going to expand with e4. You're going to get g6 most of the time. This is how black develops. They're going to fianchetto their bishop, and then they're going to castle kingside. you can continue with f4. This is obviously up to preference. There are a ton of ways to play against the Benoni. There's a solid dozen lines that you can employ depending on your playing style. This is one of my personal favorites with f4. It's a very, very nice line. It's very aggressive because you're preparing e5 and you're just expanding. You're throwing all of your pawns at your opponent because you know that they're going to be castling kingside, so there's really no use on holding back. And you're always prepared to castle either way. Usually you're going to castle queenside because you've already pushed this pawn out, so it's better to keep your king safe. At that point, you can just develop with bishop b5, for example, give that check. If the bishop blocks, you can continue with e5 and send this knight back. This would be completely winning for white. The only good move here after bishop b5, and this is something your opponent will have to know, is moving this f knight to block this check. Otherwise, your opponent loses either a tempo or a piece. For example, if they block with a knight, right away you once again push this e5 pawn, sending this knight over to the side, and then you have e6 wedged this pawn into the enemy's camp, and now you will just win a knight. If your opponent chooses to go somewhere else, you have the exact same plan with e6, and no matter what, this knight is pinned to the king, and you just win a piece, so right off the bat, you probably won this game. Blocking with the bishop is a little bit more tricky. Obviously, e5 and something like this doesn't quite work, because after e6, your opponent can just take your bishop, and, like, what are you doing, right? So in that case, you're just going to play e5, send this knight wherever it wants to go, and then you can develop normally. Or you can even take this bishop at any moment, and you will be better because you have a superior pawn structure, and your piece placement is just a little bit better. And that's pretty much the case for most Benoni lines. Benoni is considered to be slightly inferior, especially in like classical games, because you're just able to get a better position as white the majority of the time. And so this is one of those examples where you should be winning these games. And you should get comfortable with these positions because the Benoni is actually quite popular, especially in shorter time controls or among club level players. That sums up the Benoni. There's really not much to show there. We can't really play in any Jobava London System style, but I have offered you guys a pretty simple approach to the Benoni where you're just going to expand, and we're going to actually employ some of the similar tactics. For example, if you're not really able to do much after this bishop e5 check, or if your opponent knows how to deal with it, we still have ideas like pushing g4, h4, h5, or g5, as an eventuality, which is something that we should be quite familiar with if you've been following the Jobava London videos. This is something that we've been practicing a lot, especially all these kingside attacks. And since we've already played f4, there should be no problem for us. Now, last but not least, I just wanted to show you guys a quick error that a lot of players make against the Jobava London. So if they play knight f6 and this is a short time control, they can make this mistake on move 3 almost. After d5, you can play bishop f4, and now the mistake comes in the form of knight c6, where you're able to play knight b5. Now, seemingly, this is one of the more common mistakes that people can make against the Jobava system, but this is actually something that we haven't really discussed in great detail because we've been focusing on the main lines and the main ideas and the sort of structures that we will face. So what actually happens if we get to this position? Well, the only way for black to stop knight c7 is to play e5, and in that case, we can simply leave the opening an entire pawn up and in just a much greater position. So e5, capture with a bishop, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight. If your opponent chooses to play something like knight g4 in an attempt to recapture this pawn, you simply take this pawn and sacrifice your queen, seemingly. If your opponent captures your queen, you have knight c7 check, forking the queen and winning it. At this point, you can notice that we're 2 pawns up, so whatever happens after this still leaves us an entire pawn up, and we're completely fine and just winning right off the bat. Now, your opponent might not capture your queen. They might play something like c6. In that case, you capture the queen, you take away black's ability to castle, and then you go and play knight d6. Your opponent captures the pawn, you capture the bishop. All of these trades occur, and then you can castle queenside, give this check, you're a pawn up, completely fine. You should be winning this game, and you're just in a very comfortable position where you've already castled. Your development is very easy with moves like knight f3 or g3, bishop g2, and then knight f3, and you're going to be completely fine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. We've covered the entire Jobava London system in the past 7 or 8 episodes, and this was the final one. I hope you guys found these videos informative, and I hope you have just as much fun playing the Jobava London system as I do. If you enjoyed the video, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.